Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second event of the TÜSİAD Global Politics Forum. My name is Evren Balta, and I'm very pleased to welcome Hans Kundnani, Jana Puglierin, and Volkan Vural to talk about the recent German elections and what it means for Europe and Turkey-EU relations. We have simultaneous translation available. You can see the interpretation button on the bottom left of your screens. If you would like to listen to this debate in Turkish, please press interpretation button and switch to the Turkish channel. Okay, as you all know, on September 26, voters elected the Bundestag's parliament seats, and the two dominant political camps, the center-left Social Democrats, SPD, and the Conservative Alliance of Christian Democratic Union, SDU, finished only 10 seats apart. There were two winners in the election with the 25.7% of the total votes. The Social Democratic Party of Germany recorded their best results since 2005. And the Greens also achieved their best result at 14.8%. The complex coalition talks started very recently for the formation of the government, and it will take weeks. Our speakers will be talking about this probably. It will take weeks and probably months to finalize. The likely outcome maybe is the three-party federal government, usually called the traffic light coalition, which will include SDP, Greens, and the Liberal FDP. And today we will be discussing whether these elections will lay the groundwork for a different Europe and maybe a stronger and more coherent EU with our three distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them to you very briefly. Hans Kundnani is joining us from London. He's the director of the Europe program at Chatham House and a very prolific writer, regularly contributing to news outlets such as Financial Times, Guardian, TÜSİAD, Le Monde. And he's also the author of the book titled The Paradox of German Power, in which he deals with the German question and the relevance of Germany for Europe's future. Jana Puglierin is joining us from Berlin, and he is the head of ECFR's Berlin office and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations since January 2020. And she also directs ECFR's Reshape Global Europe project, which seeks to develop new strategies for Europeans to understand and engage with the changing international order. Last but not the least, we have Ambassador Volkan Vural, who is joining us from Istanbul. And Mr. Vural performed many diplomatic duties throughout his career. He was an ambassador to Bonn, Moscow, and Tehran, and permanent representative of Turkey to the UN, and also the director of Political Affairs Division in the International Secretariat of NATO. Hans, Jana, and Volkan Bey, thank you for joining us today. I would like to give the floor to you for your introductory remarks to set the scene for us, and you'll all have 7 to 10 minutes in this first round. We will then have a second round in which you will have the opportunity to respond to each other's comments very briefly. And in the remaining time we have, hopefully we will have, I'll be opening floor to the audience and we'll take their questions. Hans, if I may, let me start with you with a question that I have in mind. You have recently published several pieces on the transformation of European identity. And in those pieces, you argue that after 2008 Euro crisis and 2015 migration crisis, European identity has become more defensive, less expensive, and maybe more protective. And you also argue that EU became also more coercive and more German under Merkel's leadership. Is this pattern gonna continue? How the change of power in Germany will affect the EU or Germany in general? Is the Germany going to change, or Germany will just get a new chancellor, but the same old policies will continue? Hans, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Evren. Thanks for having me. In some ways, I'm maybe not the ideal person to go first because partly because I'm not in Germany, unlike Jana. I'm in London, and as he said, and I haven't really spent very much time in Germany at all in the last 18 months. So I'm slightly following this a little bit now from a distance. But there's also sort of another reason, which is that, you know, I've been following Germany as a think tanker for a decade now, just over a decade. And I have to say I've become quite sort of cynical about the possibility of change or the likelihood of change in Germany, because for that decade, there's always been this kind of sense that change in German policy is just around the corner, and it never quite sort of materializes. I mean, in particular, I'm thinking of economic policy, all of the, you know, issues around the euro and German economic policy, and then also security policy, which I'm sure Jana will talk more about. There's constantly been this demand, you know, from think tankers in particular, that Germany must change, and sort of a sense that it kind of, you know, it sort of has to somehow, and yet, you know, as I say, never quite materializes. And so, you know, I'm sure at some point there will be a sort of dramatic change in Germany, in German policy, that will surprise me. But until it happens, you know, my attitude slightly is, you know, well, I'll believe it when I see it. And that brings me to this election, because, you know, I did find it extraordinary how it was framed as a change election, right? Which, you know, obviously had to do with the fact that, you know, Merkel's 16 years in power was coming to an end. And so, you know, in that sense, there was going to be, you know, we knew for a fact that there was going to be a new chancellor. And I suppose on top of that, there was also, you know, this possibility that you might have, you know, a government led by a party other than the Christian Democrats, which is now looks even more likely since the election. You know, for much of the last 16 years, in the sort of, you know, the three previous elections, or at least the last two, it was sort of almost a foregone conclusion going into the election that the Christian Democrats would be the biggest party, and therefore you'd have a Christian Democrat chancellor. And so really the only question was who the junior coalition partner or partners would be. So I can see that there was a certain degree of sort of openness about this election that wasn't the case before, particularly once, you know, the polls showed, first of all, the Greens ahead and then the SPD ahead. But it seems to me at a deeper level, you know, this wasn't at all, you know, this isn't a change election at all. And one indication of that is the way that, you know, the two leading candidates, you know, who were the two real possibilities to be Chancellor, Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz, both positioned themselves as a kind of, you know, continuation of Merkel, right? They both tried to sort of convince the German public that they were more like Merkel than each other, you know, and mimicked her political style even, which I think shows how you know, even though Merkel is leaving office in some ways, you know, she's still very much present. And you know, I think, by the way, that may explain some of the volatility that there was in the polls during the election campaign, because when there's so little to choose between the different candidates, then it sort of makes sense that people would switch quite a lot from one candidate to another. And you know, I guess, you know, the way that I think about this and about Germany in the last, you know, in the Merkel period, in the last 16 years in general, is that there's been a sort of consensus. I mean, this is the way I think it's most helpful to think about Merkel and the role that she's played in German politics, is there's been a consensus which she has embodied. It hasn't really been that she's led Germany in any kind of meaningful sense, I don't think. It's simply been that there's a consensus which she's been quite good at sort of embodying. You know, and so, you know, in particular, there's been this kind of centrist consensus embodied in, you know, 3 grand coalitions in the last 4 electoral periods. By the way, there is still a remote possibility that you will have another grand coalition if the coalition negotiations collapse. But even if you don't have a grand coalition, you know, I think what you're looking at is a coalition with 3 of the 4 parties in the center of German politics who really largely agree on all of the major issues. So there are some differences of nuance, and we can get into some of those in the discussion, but they are really sort of second order differences, I think. And if you start to do this, go through the different policy areas and think about what might change depending on which, you know, coalition you have. And obviously, you know, at the moment, it looks like might well be a traffic light coalition. I think what happens when you start to go through different policy areas in detail is, we can do some of this in the discussion. It starts to actually look as if the different parties sort of cancel each other out, right? So even to the extent that they have differences in policy, what happens is, they cancel each other out. So, I'm sure we'll come on to China policy at some point. That's a good example, right? It's one of the areas in which people thought there might be change, in particular because the Greens and the FDP are a little bit more hawkish on China than the Christian Democrats are. Then if you look at the SPD, they're not more hawkish on China. And so I think, the policy differences tend to cancel each other out. I think you end up back where you are, which is a policy which looks quite a lot like the Grand Coalition's policies. I think the same goes for the Eurozone. You asked about the EU, the implications of the EU, Evren. I think, German policy towards the Eurozone looks pretty, it's a pretty similar story. You have the SPD and the Greens who might be more willing to, for example, go further in terms of debt mutualization in the Eurozone, but then the FDP absolutely don't want to go in that direction. Going to want to, probably going to want to control the finance ministry, which will be central to this. And so, again, I think you end up with a Eurozone policy probably, which looks quite a lot like the Grand Coalition's Eurozone policy. I think on some domestic policy issues, I think there is a significant difference between a traffic light coalition and a Jamaica coalition. In other words, these two options in which you have the Greens and the Free Democrats, but then the senior coalition partner is either the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats. And I think what that broadly looks like is, sort of fairly conventional sort of left-right differences, especially around these questions around how do you pay for how much do you spend on infrastructure and the green transition, but also how do you pay for it, right? And it's basically a traditional sort of left-right divide around, whether you do that through borrowing or whether you do that through tax cuts and deregulating industry and so on. This is what the FDP talks about. So I think on some of these domestic policy issues, actually, there is a little bit more to kind of fight for. But on the foreign policy issues, which I'm sure we'll come on to, I think what basically happens is the policy differences tend to cancel each other out. As I say, there are some issues, we may come on to the issues around security policy in particular and nuclear sharing and so on. I'd love to hear Jana's views on that. But I think we're talking really here about very minor shifts in German policy compared to what we've had for the last 16 years.
Okay, super, thank you. Well, along the same lines, slightly bit different though, I have a question to you, Jana. In one of the recent pieces that you wrote on German elections, you said that Merkel's successor should not be tempted to pursue a strategy of more of the same. And this is what you call the Merkel Paradox. Or the paradox of Merkel's legacy. So my question to you is this: what is this paradox, and will the new German leadership be able to fulfill the expectations of Europeans as Europe faces a raft of pressing security challenges, ranging from geopolitical upheaval to economic uncertainty to the lingering threat of COVID-19 and climate change? So pretty much the same question. Is there going to be change? What is this paradox, and how this new party can resist to this pursuing a strategy of more of the same? Thanks.
Thanks very much. I would first like to react to what Hans has said as a good German. Because the Germans would actually argue that they had changed quite a lot in recent years. When it comes to foreign policy, Germans would point, for example, to their Russia policy, which after 2014, from their perspective, from our perspective, changed quite significantly. We took a much tougher stance. We became more critical, and kind of this tendency that the Germans had, or this priority to basically prioritize relations with China over the heads of the Central and Eastern European states, that all stopped. Of course, we can argue forever about Nord Stream 2, but I would say, yes, Russia policy has shifted. Same, a good German would argue when it comes to security and defense policy, we've seen the so-called Trendwende, kind of the turnaround in defense spending. And although we are not reaching 2%, we spend 40% more for defense now than in 2014. Same on economic policy. Many Germans would argue that last year we've seen a radical shift in Germany's approach because of the support for the recovery fund that Germany not only pushed for, but then supported, helped to build consensus in the European Union. So, but I personally tend to agree with Hans, but I think change in Germany is never something that is radical, but something that comes in baby steps, something that kind of takes place slowly, that is a slow adaptation process. And I think Germans like to change just enough so that the overall system basically remains more or less the same. So we like to fix things. We don't like to radically transform things. And also looking at Merkel, I think it's true that she embodied the consensus in Germany, but in that she moved her own party quite a lot, because she moved the party basically where the consensus was and where society went. And that for the CDU, CSU brought about some radical changes from their perspective, which actually is now one of the reasons they think they have lost this election. So these are just two comments, and the rest I save for later. And I come to the paradox in a minute, but sticking with this narrative of continuity and change. So I agree with Hans that we will see more continuity than change. And that is, as I said, when I said kind of Germans don't do radical changes or revolutions, only very rarely, that is because Germany is governed by coalitions all the time. So compromise and kind of the need to work together and the need to meet somewhere in the middle is basically part of the country's political system's DNA. So different parties need to come together to agree in order to form this government. They write a coalition treaty in the very beginning that binds the coalition. And it's also part of our political system that the chancellor has not the same basically free hand that a French president has. So even if Angela Merkel wanted to transform the country radically, I think it's much more difficult in the German political system. So, but this election, and there's where I disagree with Hans, was never about change. I think it was always about continuity for most. Hans mentioned the campaign of Olaf Scholz and Armin Laschet, both basically tried to outperform each other. Who was the better Merkel? To an extent that Scholz started to, I mean, in a funny way, but copied Merkel's famous Rompus hand gesture and used her campaign slogans during the TV trials. So Scholz, I think, won because he promised continuity, reliability, and stability to the Germans, and not radical departure. And that is also because for many in Germany, the last 16 years have been good years and kind of a positive experience living in Germany when it comes to the economic situation, employment situation. People were by and large quite happy with the development of things. So I think for many, there was not an appetite for radical disruption. It's an interesting thing to look at the election results more closely, because you see basically a generational gap. You see that the young people have predominantly voted for the Greens and the FDP, and those two parties campaigned on a change ticket. Whereas the older generation, like 40 upwards, overwhelmingly has voted for the SPD and the CDU, and the average voter in Germany is 56, so the young never had a chance to push through radical reforms or to make the parties that stand for change bigger. So on foreign policy, I think one of the things that speak for continuity is also because basically German foreign policy ever since 49 is built on pillars that are so broadly accepted by nearly all the established parties that nobody wants radical disruption. So when it comes to commitment to EU integration, all the parties in the political center, the FDP, the Greens, the SPD and the CDU are committed to EU integration in different shades, but still, they are all committed to the transatlantic relationship. They are all committed to multilateralism and the famous rules-based international order. So the principles are not called into question by anybody. It's about the narcissism of small differences. And there are differences, as Hans has said, on China and Russia, where the Greens and the FDP are much more radical, but Scholz isn't. On both countries, he very much embraced Angela Merkel's policy approach and is not likely to change. And he, as the Chancellor, will be in the driver's seat because these big foreign policy portfolios are dealt with in the Chancellery. So I think that the small parties, I mean, they will be influential, they will be able to shape some things, but they will not call the shots on China and Russia. However, I'm more positive than Hans is, but I'm usually more positive than Hans is on the prospect of change vis-a-vis China, not because it's coming from within or from the parties, but because it's coming from the outside, because China is changing a lot and putting more and more pressure on Germany. You've seen this, for example, with our frigate, the Bayern, that we just sent to the Indo-Pacific, where basically the German ideal was that we can send the frigate, kind of send a signal to our transatlantic allies and kind of pretend that we are engaged, while at the same time not alienating China, because we wanted to have a stop in the kind of at the Shanghai harbor, which the Chinese didn't want. So this was basically, I put some pressure on the Germans now to realize that they cannot have it all and sit on the fence forever, because China is changing. It's more and more challenging for a German business. It's putting more pressure on Germany. And the Association for the German Business Industry has acknowledged this and has now issued already the second report with kind of urging German parties to be more critical with China. So I think if we see change, it's not because of kind of Germany from within, it's more Germany's reaction to the outside. Looking at change when it comes to security and defense, I think, again, change will be difficult. I mean, the Trendwende, kind of this, the idea to spend more for defense will prevail. However, the Greens and the SPD reject the 2% goal. I think the SPD even more wholeheartedly than the Greens, but there is a certain consensus amongst all three parties of the maybe future traffic light coalition that more money needs to be spent for the Bundeswehr. All three parties don't put NATO in question, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty details, I think we run into a lot of problems with this coalition on the NATO level, but also on the EU defense level, because when it comes to arms exports, the Greens and the SPD want to tighten the rules. That makes it harder then to cooperate with countries like France and to do joint armament projects together. The Greens were very much opposing the European Peace Facility, which under the German Council presidency was adopted. So the idea to train and equip partners in other regions. The Greens were not really falling for the European Defense Fund in its current form. And also when it comes to military missions, I think we run into trouble. And most importantly, I think that the most difficult issue will be kind of upfront in the coalition negotiations already. And that is the question whether Germany remains in NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, which I'm by now somewhat convinced that it will. But the question is, will Germany then also procure the necessary successor airplane to the aging Tornado, which needs to be phased out? And this is a very expensive procurement decision, which lays the ground for many future prosperous years of nuclear sharing. And I don't see the Greens and the SPD making that decision. So I see us at best muddling through for another 4 years. When it comes to the leadership role, I think a traffic light coalition is more likely to wholeheartedly embrace and rhetoric this rationale of a European strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. But as I said, especially when it comes to security and defense, when it comes to the detail, it will get difficult. But I think a traffic light coalition would be less scared to basically, to scare away the Americans, and would be more ready on substance or on rhetoric to embrace this narrative. Maybe a new German government on EU level, when it comes to foreign policy, will be a bit less focused on inclusivity, maybe. So because this idea that Merkel had, and this is also what is Merkelism for me on the EU level very much, is this idea to find a compromise with everybody and to sit long hours in Brussels until an agreement was found that everybody could subscribe to. And that made it incredibly slow, focus on the lowest common denominator very often. And there is more and more a realization here in Germany that this cannot stay like this. That of course we want to be inclusive, we want to have everybody on board, but that when it comes to foreign policy, we maybe need to work with a coalition of the willing within an EU framework and do more ambitious stuff with less partners. So maybe it will not be the focus on inclusivity at all costs, but still, of course, it's in Germany's DNA again to aim at for the broadest compromise possible. And the paradox is that actually we just did a poll amongst kind of 12 EU countries and asked how Germany was perceived. And we also did an expert poll last year, how Germany was perceived amongst policymakers and experts and the elites. And in both polls, kind of numbers for Germany were really great. So Germany is seen on the expert level as a partner, as a country that many other countries share interests with, but also as a partner that other countries want to work with, that is approachable, that is reactive. And in the broader public, there is also a huge appreciation of the German way. And I think that's because Merkel succeeded in building this legacy to bring everybody on board. And while this has been successful to a certain extent, I think it's not the solution to many problems that we are currently facing, especially, for example, when it comes to the rule of law crisis in Europe. Germany needs to be, I think, leading more decisively dare to take more of a position here. And when it comes to geopolitics, I think that we cannot afford to wait forever for kind of unanimity and for that compromise that never happens. So I think that her method brought Germany a lot of respect and a lot of capital that the new government can build on. But I think the environment has changed so much that Germany, with this way of doing politics, will not be able to contribute to the solutions for the many problems. Yeah, and with that, I leave it.
Super, thank you so much. Before Ambassador Volkan roll, I have a reminder, we disabled the chat function, but you can ask your questions, you can begin asking your questions using the Q&A function. Ambassador, we have been talking with Jana and Hans that there is not going to be changing much in both at the domestic front and maybe at the international front. I mean, there will be a lot of things will be changing. but very slowly, as both Hans and Jana were arguing. My question is to you is it the case for German-Turkish relations? I mean, we do have what we can call Merkel Paradox in German-Turkish relations, maybe too. For example, Merkel voiced her opposition to Turkey's full membership in the EU, yet thanks to her, Turkey and the EU kept a functioning relationship in a period of multiple crises. Is this how the Turkish-German relations are going to be changing in this new period? What is your take on this? Floor is yours.
Well, first of all, let me say that as an observer, I see the results of the German elections as a change in stability, in an environment of stability, yet change. And the elimination of the radical left or radical right, or not elimination, but the reducing the weight of these two parties, radical parties, it has concentrated on the central parties, and with different shades of opinion. Chancellor Merkel, of course, by coining this privileged partnership, has somewhat distanced Turkey from the EU accession process. Yet she was pragmatic enough to keep Turkey close enough to Germany and to the EU, and that's why her approach was a pragmatic one. But in principle, she has rejected Turkey's EU membership. In the past, two political parties, in my observation, two political parties were more or less supportive of Turkey's candidacy and EU membership. One was the SPD and the other was the Greens. In the 2017 elections, both parties' program have somewhat referred to Turkey's candidacy. But when we came to this election, I think all the political parties have distanced Turkey from the EU prospect. This includes the SPD, this includes the Greens, this includes the FDP. If a coalition of these three parties come to power, I think Turkish-EU relations should be written off. There won't be any solid progress towards accession. This is one of the fundamental problems for Turkey. The second is how the Turkish-German relations will be affected by the possible coalition. I think while they will continue the legacy of Merkel in terms of pragmatism, nevertheless, there are new issues which may strain our relations. These issues are the democracy, human rights, the Kurdish issue, and others. I think Germany, the new chancellor, despite his careful approach, will be more critical of Turkey's behavior, especially on these fronts. What will happen then? It will certainly give a new problem in our relations, and certainly it will distance Turkey from Germany, and of course by extension the EU. This will also may have a negative impact on German businessmen and investments in Turkey, because while if the government is critical of Turkey and the media especially picks up this criticism and enlarges it, then the German investors might be reluctant. Although they make their own decisions, nevertheless, they will see the environment may not be conducive unless changes happen, not in Germany, but in Turkey. And these are the issues which I see in the coming days, months. I think there's a potential over new rifts between Turkish and German relations. On the other hand, Turkish-German relations are unique in the sense that they are not foreign policy issues, they are domestic policy issues as well in both countries. And therefore, Turkey's role in the migration issue, and especially, is very important for Germany and for Europe. Therefore, they have to be careful in balancing their criticism with the need to cooperate on these issues and security issues. Therefore, I think more challenges are waiting the German government rather than Turkey at this point, how they will manage, how they will balance their principles, their declared objectives. For instance, FDP's election platform mentioned the president, our president by name, saying that under his guidance, rule, Turkey should not and will not become an EU member. This was clear even in the FDP program. The Greens also underlined democracy, human rights very much. And in the past, they were more attracted to continuing our accession negotiations and to help democracy in Turkey. But now I see a big reluctance on their part to continue a dialogue with Turkey on EU relations. So I think we will be facing new challenges. For us, I mean, there may not be many changes in Germany, but in Turkish-German relations, we can expect some changes, some elements of strain that will burden our ties, and certainly which could have implications on economic cooperation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We will have a second round this time, a shorter one. We will all have like 2 or 3 minutes. You will all have 2 or 3 minutes to respond to each other if you wish. And I do have some follow-up questions as well. I would like to start with Jana, if that's okay with you, Jana, this time. As Ambassador Vural has said that democracy will become a more important dynamic under this new leadership. I mean, whatever it be, under this new coalition. And it is often argued that with Berlin's reluctance in the last decade to get tough with the autocratizing states, I mean, that really emboldened countries which has gone through this authoritarian path to defy the EU norms. Berlin, of course, had its own reasons, but do you think how this trend is going to be evolving in this period, how it is going to shape the EU or EU norms, and more specifically, as again, Mr. Vural, Ambassador Vural has mentioned, is it going to be negatively affecting Turkey-German relations, or how is it going to be affecting Turkey-German relations? Floor is yours.
I actually don't have much to add, because I think that the ambassador just gave a very sober assessment of how things will likely develop. I think the Greens and the FDP want to make all those questions a priority: democracy, human rights, values. They want to do it in relationship with Turkey, in relationship with China, and in relationship with Russia. And it will always be, the attempt to find a balance between confrontation and criticism and the need for cooperation. I think the need to cooperate with Turkey is clearly seen in Germany and will also be seen by the next German government. I think especially the SPD, but also the other parties, because the ambassador mentioned migration. I think this is the most crucial interest that Germany now has. But yeah, expect more criticism. And I don't know how this is going to play out, because I think, as Hans has said, it will be outbalanced maybe. So on China and Russia, I already said that I think that Olaf Scholz and the Chancellery will be in the driver's seat and won't find the need to change that much. I don't know if he personally will make Turkey that much of a priority. It was a priority to Angela Merkel. I think that remains to be seen. The more he will leave this to the then foreign minister, which I think, I mean, it's not clear yet, but under a traffic light coalition, I think the foreign ministry will go to the Greens. And yeah, I only can subscribe to what the ambassador has said. I think that was very sober and very just.
I think there is a question here directed to you, Jana, and I can read that. The question, Dennis Barrett is asking that the impact of to be expected from a traffic light coalition on the well-engaged structuring armament programs such as the SCAF, next European fighter.
So shall I take this immediately?
Sure, why not? I mean, since you'll be leaving early.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, the FCAS project has been living through turbulent times for a long time now. A lot of hiccups with the French blaming the Germans and the Germans blaming the French. The FCAS project poses a problem to the Greens because two components are part of the project. It's first of all that the FCAS plane should be, from a French perspective, able to carry French nuclear weapons in the future. And although this doesn't affect Germany immediately, Germany is then kind of part of a project where, again, kind of nuclear weapons are involved. This is something that might become an issue within the Green Party, and the even more important problem from a Green perspective is the question of autonomous weapon systems, because FCAS is not only a plane, it's a system of systems. And so the Greens and also the SPD actually, but have an issue with armed drones and autonomous weapon systems, and this is part of FCAS. So the Greens will not embrace this project wholeheartedly. But at the other end, so much money has already gone into that project, and it's with the French. And in the traffic light coalition, all coalition partners, and particularly the Greens and the FDP, highlight the necessity to cooperate closely with the French. And as I said, rhetorically, we'll talk a lot about European sovereignty, and so will not torpedo the project much more. So, but I think, as I said before, also when it comes to arms exports and all these things, it will not be a flawless process in the future. But I think the Germans will continue to wanting to work with the French here. And also a traffic light coalition with the Greens being part of it.
Great. Hans, there is an open question here. I may read it to you. I mean, you can still respond to what Volkan and Jana has said, but the question is about Merkel and whether she was able to shift her party towards more center, or CDU was not able to adjust itself to Merkelism, thus lost the election. Something in that line. I mean, whether has the center held in Germany, or whether the mainstream parties have embraced the far right's position on core policy preoccupations like immigration, identity politics, and this and that. So what is the center question? This is basically.
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually it links to something that Jana said that I wanted to respond to, because I mean, it's clearly true, as you said, Jana, that part of what I was describing, this sort of inertia in German politics, is structural, right? Partly because, as you said, you have to have coalition governments, but it's not only that, it's also that, the federal system and the independent institutions that you have in Germany, like the Constitutional Court and so on, which sort of push you towards that kind of inertia. But I do think it's important to stress that Merkel has had a transformational effect on that structural kind of dynamic in Germany. And I think you kind of indicated this yourself, Jana, because you said, she's moved her party, right, to the center. And this goes exactly to this question that was asked. I think that there has been something qualitatively different. It was always the case that German governments were coalitions, mostly, but there has been something qualitatively different since 2005 when Merkel first became chancellor, which is, in particular, you've had 3 grand coalitions out of 4 electoral periods. And before that, there'd only ever been 1 grand coalition in the history of the Federal Republic. And it was very much seen as an exception. It's now almost become the norm. And, a lot of people now are relieved that we're not going to have another grand coalition, right? Which shows how much it's become the norm, right? There is something that Merkel kind of, I think Merkel did have an impact on that. And part of the way she did this, as I think you were saying, was to move the CDU to the left on social issues, which I think complemented the way that the SPD, going back to Schröder, had moved to the right on economic issues, and you get this centrist kind of consensus around that. So there's a sort of greater kind of centrist consensus than there was before, even though there was a structural pressure towards that in German politics in general. And by the way, and this, to again return to this question, you said, Jana, that she pushed her party to where society was, or the consensus was. Now, I think that's half true. It's true in the sense that she got lots of new votes. By the way, a lot of support, in particular from people in Berlin think tanks, right? But she lost a lot of support as well along the way. So I don't think it's true that this is just where society was, and she was kind of bringing her party in line. There's been a massive consequence of that, which is the AfD. So Volkan Bey was saying, this is a sort of, the outcome of this is stability and centrism, and the extremist parties have lost. I would look at this slightly differently, which is, to me, to a large extent, Merkel created the AfD. Even the name, there is, the alternative for Germany was a direct response to her politics and no alternatives, right? So, in some ways, I think the clearest aspect of Merkel's legacy is the fact that you now have a far-right party in the Bundestag for the first time in the history of the Federal Republic, and it's not going anywhere. We can talk more about that, but just maybe very, very quickly on a couple of the other things. I think I slightly also disagree with Jana a little. I mean, I'm trying to find disagreements here because I think we broadly agree, but I think I slightly disagree on the way you characterise Merkel's approach to the EU, this sort of inclusivity approach. I know that's the spin, that this is what Merkel is like, but when you look at so many of the key issues, whether it's the EU-Turkey deal, which is obviously particularly relevant for this discussion, or whether it's the Energiewende, in 2011, or whether it's Nord Stream 2, I mean, it doesn't feel to me like this is a chancellor who is trying to keep all Europeans on board and is being super inclusive. There's been lots of unilateralism kind of going on there as well. But I guess my question for you, Jana, is, you sort of almost seem to be saying, look, that was Merkel's approach. It doesn't work anymore because of these new challenges. And you kind of seem to be saying Germany needs to get tough with other EU member states. And I'd love to hear what that looks like, because I find that, that is interesting, but I think that could potentially be quite dangerous for Germany and for the EU. And then finally, just on Turkey, because, in particular, this question around what the new government's approach to Turkey might be. I mean, I guess, as you said, Volkan Bey, that the two things which characterize Merkel's approach, what's specific about Merkel's approach to Turkey is, firstly, as you said, the privileged partnership idea, as opposed to accession. And I completely agree with you there that essentially accession is not going anywhere now. But the other aspect of it was the EU-Turkey deal, which I mentioned already, on the refugee question. And I'd love to hear your thoughts there on what happens in relation to that question, particularly because of Afghanistan, right? So the way that, Afghanistan became an issue in the German election campaign because of this fear of a new wave of refugees. And the way this was framed, particularly by Laschet, was there can be no repeat of 2015. Now, Erdogan has always threatened to kind of, unleash some new wave of refugees. And so I wonder just how that plays out. My impression, without being an expert on this, is that actually there's not going to be very many refugees that are even going to get to Turkey because of all the border closures in between Afghanistan and Turkey. But if they were to get there, and to the extent that they get there, I would be curious on your take about how Erdogan potentially uses that in the climate in which, you know, as you say, you know, there's potentially going to be more frictions between Turkey and the EU. Sorry, I went on for too long.
No, that's great. Questions are great. Welcome, Ambassador. The two questions Hans actually asked. One is about the role of AFD. I mean, it was not a direct question, but he mentioned your view on AFD. And there is a question from Namıktan on AFD. What would you say about the performance? And I'm reading the question. What would you say about the performance of the far-right party and the future of populism in German politics? Namıktan asks. And also Hans's question about migration deal and role of Afghanistan and how migration issue is going to be affecting Turkish-German relations. So and any other thing that you would like to respond, floor is yours.
Me or Hans?
Is it back to me?
No, Ambassador Volkan.
First of all, I think Turkey is already suffocated by the refugee crisis. We have over 4 million Syrians in Turkey, Iraqis, Afghans, and so forth. And Turkey is overburdened with the refugees. In the domestic politics, anti-refugee movements are taking place and actions are taking place. Therefore, Turkey cannot and will not probably accept any further refugees from anywhere. President Erdogan has stated this very clearly, that we are up to our neck with the refugees. And it's, as you know, I mean, if a refugee stays more than a couple of years in a certain country, they continue to stay on and they are unlikely to return. Therefore, this causes social, economic, cultural problems for Turkey. The refugee deal was a pragmatic solution at a certain time for its own safety. But now I don't think such a deal could be made. The Greens have clear objections against the refugee deal, and Turkey has also a mistrust on such deals. Therefore, but on the other hand, Europe, in order to be more safer, they have to help Turkey. In the past, the help from Europe, from the European Union, has come too late, too little, and therefore it didn't create the necessary impact. It didn't alleviate the problem. And Turkey is now faced with this problem. Therefore, it would be, I think, very, very careful in dealing with the EU on refugee matters. There's a question of trust, question of double standards, and so forth. So I think it is, will there be more refugees in Turkey? It depends on how the Afghan situation will evolve. But as you said, Iran has taken certain measures against the flow of refugees. Turkey has taken some measures to prevent a flow of refugees. But there's another potential, that is in Idlib, in Syria. There is about 3.54 million people living in Idlib, and they are faced with terrorism and so forth. We fear most from a refugee flow from Idlib at this moment rather than anything else. And it will be a tremendous burden on Turkey. And therefore, I think it's in the interest of Europe, European Union, to help Turkey to cope with this refugee questions. for its own safety, for its own well-being, rather than as a courtesy, as a help to Turkey.
Thank you, Ambassador. Jana, maybe I can direct this AFD question to you as well. Namık Tan's question about the performance of the far right in German elections. And this was also the question of Hans, or the comment of Hans. And Hans also asked you or responded to you in terms of Merkel's unilateralism. So maybe you would like to respond to him in that issue, in that matter as well. So I know that you are supposed to be leaving, you have to leave at 5:15. So
there is still time, and I always like to answer questions. They are always interesting. And I have 3 points that I wanted to answer to Hans's remarks. So first, coming back to the structural aspects and the personality, I actually agree that Merkel was not, that her ambition was never to really transform the country. So, and that is the difference to what Gerhard Schröder and Joschka Fischer did when they were in office from 1998 to 2005. So when they came into office, Schröder had a political mission. He had a project. You cannot, you did not need to share his vision, and maybe can say that this destroyed the Social Democratic Party, but nevertheless, he had a clear vision. He wanted to transform the country, and he managed. And that was the last time, actually, that Germany did so far ranging reforms. Merkel always said, yeah, grand coalition and compromise are not possible, but there was a period when she actually was elected with 40% of the votes and had a liberal coalition partner, and there was no project. I think she basically, Merkel stood for quite radical neoliberalism before 2005, but then, she never followed through with it. So I think there is a point. So if you have a strong personality, Merkel undoubtedly was a strong personality, but with a mission in mind, I think even in Germany, there can be more change than we have seen in the past 16 years. So I grant you this. Second, on the rise of the AfD, I think there is some truth to it, that Merkel moved the CDU under her so much to the center that a lot of people inside her own party were not really happy to see this, because they thought that she was basically selling the unique selling point of the party, that she was watering down what conservatism meant, and that not from within the CDU, but from kind of people to the right. The idea to form a new party emerged also in reaction to her approach of the Eurozone crisis, where she was hugely criticized even from within her own party. I was working in parliament at that time, 2011 to 2012, and there was so much opposition towards her Eurozone policy, and so many sympathy for kind of throwing out Greece back then. So that is true. Still, I think currently, when you look at this election and also last election, so the CDU now did not lose most votes to the right. So the poor performance of the CDU this time did not strengthen the AfD. And we've seen this in previous elections, for example, with the CSU in Bavaria. Whenever the CDU tried to copy the AfD in order to bring voters back, that didn't really work. So the CDU this time lost much more to other parties of the center, which I think is also quite telling, because the AfD dropped to 10%. And I think this is the core of the AfD. That doesn't mean that it cannot rise again, but I think it has been shrinking. The AfD has lost 3%, I think, due to the poor performance of the party, and because they had this one topic that was migration, and because that did not disappear, it came back in the election campaign, but to a lesser extent. So I think that Germans need to live with the fact that we have a far-right party in parliament that won't go away again. This is a fact. And I think that is to a certain extent also normal, looking at other European countries with far-right parties in parliament. Germany is no exception here. What worries me personally is the development in the former East, because here the AfD was the strongest party in two of our so-called Länder, of our regional states, Saxony and Thuringia. Again, not because the AfD gained voters, but because the CDU was so weak. So the AfD came first because of the weak performance of the CDU, but still in all the countries that of the former GDR, of the Länder, the AfD is in double digits, above 18%, and a really decisive factor. And here I see also more sympathies from the CDU in these regions to open up to working with the AfD, much more than in Berlin and kind of on the national level in the kind of party headquarters. But here, I think that we need to closely watch how this will develop, because in the regions, in the states, it is increasingly difficult to form governments without the AfD. But in general, I think in this election, as the ambassador has said, the fringes have lost and the center was strengthened. I mean, the left party, even to an extent that they could not make the 5% threshold, and that they enter parliament only because they gained 3 direct mandates, and the AfD also overall lost. So I don't see huge momentum for the AfD at the moment. But I think that doesn't say anything. I think we have seen the potential of the party after 2016. And I think if we see another crisis that fuels kind of their narrative, I think they can easily rise again. So on inclusivity, of course, Germany had many Sonderwege on EU level in the past, and big ones, not small ones. But I still think that the overall focus was often on getting everybody on board. I think that was the overall, for me, dominant narrative, and there was an incredible patience, or if you want to frame it positively, a certain special understanding for the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I've heard this also from so many capitals in Central and Eastern Europe that they will miss Merkel most, because no next German chancellor will just try to engage with them as much as Merkel did. So what I say is just based on the huge amount of appreciation that I hear, and not only from Poland and Hungary, where Germany or Merkel herself has been far too reluctant to criticize Orban for not ideological but purely business-oriented reasons and party politics. But I think this patience with Hungary and Poland, I see this coming to an end with the new government. At least I think it will be less generous. But at the same time, I think especially vis-a-vis Poland, it's incredibly difficult for Germany to find the right balance between criticism and respect of Poland, and kind of also respect for what German history and Polish-German relations. But when I say Germany needs to become tough, I think when it comes to rule of law, I think now we have a wonderful example at hand, and we can talk forever about the similarities of the verdict of the Bundesverfassungsgericht last year and what the Poles now did. I think there are significant differences, but of course, the verdict in Germany didn't help at all. But I think, so we need to find a way forward here, because if we don't, I think the EU might crumble. And in general, when I say Germany needs to become tough, I want us to Europeanize our China policy. I want, and I know you want that too, I want that the next German government does what we want. basically. And when it comes to security and defense, I mean, Germany is the forever sleeping giant. And here I share very much Hans's pain. This kind of the awakening is just around the corner, and then you wait forever, and then nothing awakes. But here, so this is a think tanker basically thinking that she knows better what to do, and I would like to see a more forceful German foreign and security policy with more defense spending, more capabilities, more readiness. But to be honest, the likelihood of what I want is somewhat limited.
Evren, do you mind if I respond very briefly to, before Jana goes, to one thing? I'd love to hear her thoughts on something. Is that okay? So the other, you made this point, Jana, about the generational difference in Germany, right? Young people wanted change and older people wanted things to stay the same. I'm really curious about, you know, if we imagine that only young people had voted, right? Let's say it's only people under 40 or something who voted. I'd be curious to know what that would look like. And in particular, what you just said about security policy, right? Because you know, you're sort of urging, you know, think tankers are urging Germans to be tougher and you know, more forceful and sort of confrontational towards China and Russia and so on. Is that what young people in Germany want? If anything, I have the sense they might be going in the other direction.
That depends what you mean with tougher. So we will have many new young parliamentarians, actually. It's very interesting to watch the Jusos and the SPD and many climate activists in the Greens. So their instincts are certainly much less established and much less centristic. But I think when it comes to kind of the emphasis on democracy, human rights, and all of this, kind of you find many sympathies. The question they have, and where we differ, the young and I, is if military means are an acceptable instrument to back whatever you call for in rhetoric up with kind of hard stuff. Yeah, whether you want to carry the big stick, which I think we need to carry, but this is, I think, where it gets difficult. But I think all the rhetorical emphasis, they are a lot more radical than kind of the older generations in the parties, especially when it comes to climate activism. So, yeah.
May I inject a thought? I think the CDU-CSU has gained around 40%, over 40% of the votes in the 2013 elections. When we came to 2017, they received around 32% of the votes. Now it has declined to 24 something votes. Does this show that the appeal of the CDU as a party, irrespective of the popularity of Merkel, has declined within the German community, whether young or old?
Well, I would say, and then Hans, but I would say that Merkel's popularity actually peaked in 2013, but when she was elected in 2005, but I need to check the numbers. The result wasn't great either. So it was really small margin, similar to what we see now. And so I think that I think that basically Merkel was always much more popular than the CDU-CSU. I think because she embodied so many things, and she was that projection sphere where people could just project their expectations on. That's why I think the CDU was never as famous as Merkel was, and the better results we've seen was also they were also due to Merkel's popularity. That would be my guess, but of course we see the erosion of the Big 10 parties in Germany. We've seen this with the SPD for a long time. I think now we see a similar thing with the CDU, and this is something that we see in other European countries as well. I think we will not go back to previous strengths.
Okay, I think Jana now has to go. It's 5:15, right on time. We finished. I mean, there are some other questions directed to Jana, but unfortunately, I won't be asking them to you.
Answer that all.
What is it?
Hans can answer them all. He knows my thinking, but I'm pretty sad that I need to leave. It was a very interesting conversation. I really appreciated it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we have a question for Hans. I mean, the friend's question, actually. Did you see the question? Maybe I should read it because the audience cannot see the questions, only we can see the question. I'm reading it. And the question is, quote, Merkel was able to check the ambitions of Macron. It appears traffic light or Jamaica will not be totally against or fully enthusiastic on European strategic autonomy. With such a blurry position, don't you think France will dominate the rhetoric? In other words, do you think the new government will be able to pressure parties on such issues or remain idle or uninterested? Barchan Yinanch is asking, by the way, I forgot to mention Gülseren Onanch's name, who asked the center question to you. So this is basically the idea that you have been playing with for some time, this civilizational aspect of Europe held by Macron and versus the competitive Europe. Please go ahead.
Thanks for coming back to that, because you asked me about that at the beginning and I sort of slightly avoided it to talk about Germany, but it's nice to come back to it. So yeah, this is a great question and there's a lot there. I think the first thing I would say, and I'll come to this civilizational idea in a minute, but I think the first thing to say is I personally, and this may have been clear already from what I said earlier on, but I personally believe that German power in Europe, in the EU, doesn't actually have a lot to do with Merkel. It's much more structural than that. So, I mean, I think, that there has been a lot of sort of speculation about whether somehow German power within the EU is weakened because there's nobody, that Merkel's successor won't have her stature, and this will, somehow translate into German sort of influence or power. I think this is, largely exaggerated, that really German power is structural, and the next chancellor won't sort of somehow dramatically be weaker than Merkel was. Then on this question of strategic autonomy, which the questioner asked about, I mean, there's a lot I could say about that, and actually Jana would have a lot to say about this too if she was still here, but I think that's not really going anywhere very much, at least on the security side. It's something that France is pushing, but I think that, actually what happens if you try to push that agenda within the EU is you end up dividing the EU, and potentially actually France becomes isolated because there's very little support, I think, in other parts of the EU and even in Germany for that agenda. And that then brings me to this, to the sort of civilizational kind of idea, and in particular, that, in a way, the dynamic between Germany and France and between Merkel and Macron, because my sort of reading of what's happened over the last, 5 or 6 years since Macron became French president was that, he first of all comes up with this, alternative vision for Europe. I mean, an alternative to Merkel's vision. And it was this idea of l'Europe qui protège, the Europe that protects. And I think that when he first proposed that idea, when he became French president, what he was talking about was actually economic protection. It was kind of protecting European citizens from the market. And what he really wanted to do was to try to reform the Eurozone and create a more redistributive EU. Now that was rejected by Merkel, or sort of ignored by Merkel. And what I think has happened is that Macron has now sort of reinvented that idea of l'Europe qui protège, not so much around economic protection, but around cultural protection, in particular from Islam, from Muslims. And you see that very much in the debate that's happening in France around all of these questions around immigration and Islam and so on. So that's kind of really in a nutshell what I meant by the sort of civilizational turn in the European project. It's a sort of complex function of the dynamic between Germany and France, but in particular, I mean, it's kind of, I think, really being pushed by France. Also, I think some of the Central and Eastern European member states that have been discussed, like Orban in Hungary, rather than Germany. But in a funny way, it's sort of an indirect response to some of the German approach to the EU in the last 10 years.
Okay, Great, thanks.
Evren,
Yes, please.
as I'm wearing a tie today, and today is International Girls' Day, and I have to attend certain activities there, so I want to apologize, but in 5 minutes I have to leave.
Okay, then maybe you would like to answer one more question and give some, a closing remark and respond to what Hans has just said. And the question is from Shafak Göktürk, and I'm reading that. Wasn't the Turkey-EU refugee deal of March 2016 in effect a deflection point in that relationship, as the agreement assigned to Turkey a buffer role to safeguard the EU while separating her clearly from the EU space?
Yes, I think the deal was basically to safeguard Europe rather than helping Turkey to deal with the problems. It did alleviate Turkey's problems because the funds received were not enough. And secondly, the Turkish government and the municipalities have spent billions of dollars for the refugees. Therefore, the burden of refugees is on the shoulders of Turkey. And I think it will be difficult to agree on a new deal on those terms. The best thing is first, the countries must look at the origin of the refugees and try to cope with the situation over there rather than Turkey. Because Turkey, as a transit country, is trying to restrict movements, but nevertheless, it is very difficult. And therefore, it's for Europe and Turkey, we need trust, mutual trust, and confidence in dealing with these issues, rather than looking at the narrow interest, national self-interest.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Instead, I muted myself. Happens sometimes. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. You have to leave. It will be just Hans and me. There are a couple of questions. I'm not sure whether these are Hans's expertise on energy and climate politics, but maybe after, maybe you can. So thank you, Ambassador, for joining us.
Yeah, we are certainly leaving you in good hands.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'd love to try and answer that question as well, though.
Sure.
The
Go
one
ahead,
on
please.
the EU-Turkey relationship.
Oh, sure.
Because it does really link with what I was saying a minute ago. I certainly think of the refugee crisis in 2015 as being a critical juncture in the history of the EU. I think that's how we're going to look back on it. I think things have changed since 2015. But I really meant in terms of the way that the EU sees itself and internally in the EU. Whereas the question was saying, is 2015 or 2016, I guess in this case, a critical junction for the EU-Turkey relationship? And that's really interesting, because it seems to me that, so my argument about the civilizational turn in the European project is that basically since that critical juncture of 2015, pro-Europeans have sort of imagined the EU in much more cultural or civilizational terms than they used to. In particular defined against Islam. Now, I think that does have an indirect consequence for the EU-Turkey relationship, because it becomes even harder, I think, for Europeans to imagine Turkey being part of the EU than it previously was. Now, I think accession was already essentially kind of stalled even before the refugee crisis happened. But I think it is true that it's now become, I think, this isn't my view, but I think for a lot of Europeans, it's become unthinkable to have Turkey in the EU now for cultural reasons, essentially. That was already quite a strong current, particularly in German and French thinking. It's part of what led to the privileged partnership idea with Merkel, but I think that has been really strengthened by the refugee crisis. But I think the other part of the question, though, was that somehow the new role that the EU has assigned to Turkey is to sort of safeguard the EU from refugees. And that I'm not sure about, because you know, actually what happened in the aftermath of the refugee crisis of 2015 is two things that stopped the refugee flows. One was the EU-Turkey deal, but there was also the closing of the Balkan route and the various other measures that were taken. And so even if you didn't have the EU-Turkey deal, it's not clear to me, for example, that refugees would have been able to make their way to Germany. There may have been a massive humanitarian crisis in Greece, but it's not clear that the refugees could have actually gone any further. So I'm not sure that that part of the question, I'm not sure I agree with, that the EU has somehow, you know, accepted the idea that that Turkey is you know, safeguarding it. I would put it in a slightly different way, which is I think that what's happened is that the EU has gone from seeing Turkey as a potential EU member state to being a threat.
Something is going on there. Volkan Bey, can you hear us? I don't know what's going on.
Can I keep going? Or?
I'm trying to unmute him, but I can't even do that. Maybe, I don't know. Now there, I think. Okay.
So yes,
go ahead, please.
I just think that the EU has gone from seeing Turkey as a potential member state to being a threat, and that, as I say, ties in with a sort of broader way. I mean, that's roughly what I think has happened in the last decade, is that the EU has increasingly seen the world in terms of threats from Russia, from China, even from the United States, and you know, from migrants. And then I think Turkey is another sort of essentially now perceived as being a threat, you know, against which the EU must defend itself. And then, so should I try and answer the energy and climate questions?
I think that's the last question, right? I mean, there are some other questions, but partially answered.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm not at all an expert on German energy policy, but you know, my quick answer to that would be, you know, yes, I basically agree that there is this kind of tension in Germany's approach that's quite difficult actually to reconcile these two different things. So on the one hand, you know, Germany does have these green aspirations. It probably thinks of itself as being one of the greenest countries in the world. But at the same time, it has this economy that's based on manufacturing industry that's very energy intensive. And so one example of that is when Merkel, you know, passed the Energiewende after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. You know, what you have is a, you know, abandonment of nuclear power, but at the same time, all these carve-outs for manufacturing industry, so that they don't really have to make that transition as quickly as you know, they really ought to have done. And so I think that is exactly the contradiction in Germany's approach to climate. You know, it's quite interesting if you compare Germany to the UK. I mean, most people would think of Germany as being a much greener country, but the UK is doing a much better job of reaching its climate goals than Germany is for these exact reasons.
Thank you, Has, and thank you for sticking with us till to the end. I mean, thank you to all our panelists. In fact, even if they're not here with us, to Jana, Puglierin, and Ambassador Volkan, Vural, huge thanks to all three of you. This was a phenomenal discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And to the audience, thank you for listening to us, asking great questions, and investing your time with us on a Monday afternoon. So we really, really do appreciate your interest. And with this note, I am closing the webinar. Thank you, Hans, again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.